family doesn't owe family a roof. That's the sentence my father said the night he set 2 trash bags of my clothes on the front porch and changed the locks behind me. I was 17. My mother stood in the lit doorway with her arms crossed and watched. And when I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" she said that wasn't their problem anymore because I'd made my choices. 11 years later, the 2 of them are sitting on that same porch, in the cold, and they are begging me, not for forgiveness, for the roof. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I set my bag on the rail and unzipped it. Inside that bag was one folded document, 3 pages, with a raised seal pressed into the corner and a stamp from the county recorder's office across the top. A date, a book number, a page number, a transfer on death deed, recorded 11 years ago in an office downtown by a hand that was not my father's and not my mother's, and they did not know it existed. They thought they still owned the house they'd thrown me out of. They were sitting on the porch of a thing that was no longer theirs to give, asking me to honor a promise they'd never made, dated, witnessed, and on file with the county. And they were so sure I'd say yes because what kind of daughter wouldn't? Here, take the seat closest to the lamp where it's warm. This is one I've held a long time, and I tell it slow. For the nights the house is too quiet, when you go back over the people who were supposed to keep you safe and try to figure out the exact hour they stopped. So before I tell you how it ended, let me ask you because I've turned it over 1,000 times, and I still don't know if my hand should have stayed as steady as it did. If the people who put you out in the cold at 17 showed up old and frightened on that same cold porch, would you open the door or would you let the paper speak? Mine spoke. Now, let me tell you how it began. My name is Ruth. I'm 28 years old as I tell you this, and for the first 17 years of my life, I lived in a yellow house on Lattimore Street with a wide front porch my grandfather built with his own hands. I want you to picture that porch because it's the center of everything I'm about to tell you. 2 steps up, a railing my grandfather sanded smooth, a swing on one end that creaked in a way I could find in my sleep. That porch is where my grandmother shelled peas in the summer. It's where I learned to read sitting in her lap. And it's where, when I was 17, my father stood and told me that family doesn't owe family a roof, while my mother watched and agreed. I have to tell you about my grandmother now, Eleanor, because she's the reason any of this is possible, and because she is the only person in that house who ever looked at me like I was a person and not a verdict. The house on Lattimore was hers. Her husband, my grandfather, built it. She'd lived in it her whole married life and her long widowhood, and when my parents fell on hard times in my early childhood, she took us in, her son, my father, and his wife, and me. It was always understood, the way things are understood in families without ever being said out loud, that it was Grandma Eleanor's house, and we were living in it. My father never quite forgave that arrangement. A man living under his mother's roof at 50 carries it like a stone, and my father carried his by being twice as hard on the one person in the house who couldn't fight back. That was me. Let me give you one afternoon so you'll know exactly the kind of house it was. I was maybe 9. I'd brought home a spelling test with a gold star on it, the first gold star of my life, and I ran up those 2 porch steps with it, held out in front of me like a candle I was afraid of dropping. My father was in his chair on the porch with a beer sweating in his hand, and I showed it to him, and he looked at it for about as long as it takes to read a price tag, and he said, "And what's that supposed to get you?" Not a question. He didn't even hand it back. He let it hang in the air until my arm got tired. And from inside the screen door, I heard my grandmother's voice, and she came out onto that porch slow on her cane, and she took the test out of my hand like it was a treaty between nations, and she read every word of it out loud, and then she said, "Ruthie, you put this on the icebox where God and everybody can see it." And she walked it inside herself. I want you to hold those 2 reactions side by side because that's the whole map of my childhood right there on one porch. A man who measured everything by what it could get him, and an old woman who measured a child by what the child was worth. I didn't have the words for it then. I have them now. One of them was raising me to disappear. The other was quietly, stubbornly, getting ready to make sure I didn't. I'm not going to pretend I was an easy teenager, because I wasn't, and I don't want you taking my side because you think I was perfect. I was angry, and I was loud, and I asked questions a girl in that house was not supposed to ask, but I want to be precise about what got me thrown out, because for 11 years my parents told a version where I was a wild girl who ran off, and that version is a lie. What happened was that at 17, I found out my father had been taking money out of an account my grandmother kept for my college, money she'd put aside dollar by dollar from her own pension, in my name. And I said so out loud at the dinner table. I asked him to his face why my college money was paying for his truck, and that was the unforgivable thing. Not anything I did, something I saw and refused to unsee. I want to slow down on how I found out because it matters, and because it's the first time you'll meet the man who turns out to hold a corner of this whole story. There was a neighbor 2 doors down, an old widower named Walter Pence, who'd been my grandfather's friend back when the street was young, and who'd stayed my grandmother's friend after my grandfather passed. Walter had worked 30 years as a teller and then a manager at the very bank my grandmother used, the small one on the corner with the brass handles, and even retired. He still did people's paperwork for them at his kitchen table for the price of a cup of coffee. My grandmother had sent me to Walter that week with a question about my college account. A simple thing, a balance she wanted checked because her eyes were going and she didn't trust the statements they mailed. And Walter sat me down at his kitchen table and he ran his finger down a column and his face changed and he went very quiet. And then he said, "Ruthie, who's been making withdrawals against this." I didn't know what a withdrawal was. Not really. But I understood the shape of his face. He showed me, line by line in his careful old hand, where the money my grandmother had set aside for me had been bled out, a little at a time, over 2 years. He didn't tell me what to do with it. He just made sure I saw it clearly, the way an honest man does. And then he said one thing I didn't understand until much later. He said, "Your grandmother is going to want to know about this, and I'd be careful who else hears that you do." 3 days after I said it out loud at that dinner table, my clothes were in 2 trash bags on the porch, and the locks were changed. And the story they told everyone, including my grandmother, was that I'd become impossible and left on my own. Here is the part they didn't count on. My grandmother did not believe them. Eleanor was 81 that year and slowed in her body, but there was nothing slow about her mind, and she had watched her son for 50 years and knew exactly what he was. She couldn't stop them putting me out. By then, my father had taken over the practical running of everything, the bills, the bank, the talking to doctors, the way the strong take over the old. But she could do one thing, and she did it quietly, and she did it well. She found me. I'd been sleeping on the floor of a friend's mother's apartment across town, and one afternoon there was a knock, and it was a car service my grandmother had paid for, with a note in her shaking handwriting that said only, "Come see me Thursday. Your father golfs Thursdays, and tell no one." So on Thursdays, for a while, I went back to the yellow house when my father was gone, and my grandmother and I sat on that porch she loved, and she told me things. She told me she was sorry, which no adult in my life had ever said to me. And one Thursday she told me she'd been to see a lawyer. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. She said, "Ruthie, this house is mine, free and clear. Your grandfather and I paid the last of it before he died, and your father thinks that when I go, it falls to him like a ripe apple, and I have decided it will not." She told me she had signed something called a transfer on death deed. I didn't know what it was. She explained it the way she explained everything, slowly, so I'd remember. She said, "It means the house is still mine as long as I'm breathing. I live here, it's mine, nobody can stop me. But the day I die, it doesn't go into the will where your father can fight over it. It goes straight to the person named on the deed." And then she put her dry hand over mine and said, "I named you." I want to be honest with you about how I felt at 17, sitting on that porch, because it wasn't triumph. I was frightened. I told her she couldn't do that Dad would be furious, that I didn't want the house. I just wanted things to be okay. And she laughed, a small, tired laugh, and she said, "Things are not going to be okay, child, not the way you mean, and I am too old to pretend otherwise to make you feel better." She said the deed was already done, already recorded. She'd had the lawyer's man take it to the county recorder's office downtown himself and stamp it into the official books, so it couldn't be quietly lost or torn up by anyone who came looking. She said, "It's not in a drawer where it can disappear. It's in the county's own records now with a seal on it in a book with a number." And then she told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, and I held on to it without knowing why. She said, "You need 2 grown people of good character to watch you sign a thing like this and put their names to it so it can never be called a lie." And I asked her who watched her sign, and she smiled and said, "2 people who loved your grandfather. One was the lawyer's own girl, and the other one walked over from 2 doors down with his good pen in his shirt pocket. You go on and figure out the rest." Then she said the sentence I carried for 11 years. She said, "I can't give you a childhood back, Ruthie, but I can make sure the people who took it don't get to keep the porch. Just don't tell them. Let them think they have it. Some debts are better collected late." My grandmother died the following spring. I was 18 by then, on my own, working 2 jobs, and I was not told she was dying until she was nearly gone, and I was not welcome at the funeral my father arranged. I grieved her from the back of a church I wasn't allowed inside of, and after she passed, the family story hardened into stone. The yellow house was my father's now, his inheritance from his mother, and I was the ungrateful girl who'd run off and didn't even come to the funeral. They moved through their grief and into the house's new chapter, believing every inch of it belonged to them. And it didn't. The deed my grandmother recorded did exactly what she built it to do. It sat quiet in the county's books, seal and stamp and all, saying nothing, waiting. The house was theirs to live in. It was never theirs to keep. Now I have to let some years go by, and I have to let them go by honestly, because this is the part where it would be easy to make myself sound stronger than I was. But before I do, I want to tell you about 3 things that happened across those years. 3 times the family reached across the distance to remind me what I was to them, because I didn't simply drift quietly into adulthood untouched. They kept touching. Each time, it was a little colder than the last. The first came about a year after the funeral. A letter arrived at the friend of a friend's address where I'd last been reachable, forwarded twice, my name spelled wrong. It was from my father, the only thing he wrote me in 11 years. And I thought, standing in a stairwell holding it, that maybe it was the apology. It was not. It was 2 paragraphs informing me that my grandmother's few personal effects had been dealt with, that there was nothing here belonging to you, and that I shouldn't make trouble for your mother by reaching out. That was it. No "how are you?" no "where are you sleeping?" A man writing to a child he'd put on the curb, and the entire purpose of the letter was to make sure I understood I had no claim to so much as a photograph. I learned later there had been a box. My grandmother had set aside a box for me, marked with my name in her hand, her good thimble and a few books and the Gold Star spelling test she'd kept all those years. And my father had thrown it out with the trash before the body was even cold. That's the first rung. He didn't just take the house. He went looking for the small things she'd loved me with and threw them away on purpose. The second came when I was 22. I had clawed my way to the middle of a community college degree, working nights at a hospital cafeteria, and I'd finally gotten a little ahead. First real apartment, a bed off the floor. I made the mistake of being findable. My mother called, not to see me, to tell me, in a voice with company in it, that my father's sister, my Aunt Carol, was hosting a family Christmas. And naturally, you understand it would be uncomfortable for everyone if you came. I hadn't asked to come. I hadn't known there was a Christmas. The whole call existed to disinvite me from a room I didn't know had a door. And she finished it by saying, We just think it's healthier for you to make your own way, dear, after the choices you made. The choices I made at 17, the choice to notice a theft. I hung up and I sat on my new bed in my new apartment, and I understood that there was an entire family on the other side of town having holidays, passing dishes, retelling the story of the impossible girl who ran off, and that the story was load-bearing for them now. They needed me to be the villain so they didn't have to be. That's the second rung. They built a family around my absence and then called to make sure I knew I wasn't invited to it. The third one is the one that nearly broke me, and it's the smallest. When I was 25, I sent a card. I want to be honest about that weak, hungry thing in me, because you may have it too. My father had a birthday, a big round number, and some part of me that I am not proud of bought a plain card and wrote 4 sentences in it. Careful ones. Nothing accusing, just, I'm doing all right. I think about the porch. I hope you're well. And I mailed it. And I hated myself for the little flicker of hope I felt doing it. The card came back. Not returned to sender. Worse. It came back inside another envelope, and someone, my mother's handwriting, had written across my 4 sentences, across my own words, in pen, "He doesn't want this," and then mailed it back so I would have to read my own hope with their rejection written through it. That's the third rung, and it's the one I want you to sit with for a second, because it tells you everything. A grown woman took the time to find an envelope and a stamp, not to keep me out, but to make sure my reaching out cost me something. They didn't just close the door. They made sure I felt my knuckles break against it. After that, I stopped reaching. I built a wall where the door had been, and for a long time I thought the wall was the best I'd ever do. So the truth is, the 11 years between that porch and this one were hard, and they were lonely. And for a long stretch of them, I was not a woman holding a secret weapon. I was just a girl who'd been thrown away, working nights, finishing a degree 1 course at a time, flinching every time someone raised their voice. I didn't think about the deed as a weapon. Mostly, I tried not to think about it at all, because thinking about it meant thinking about her, about Eleanor, about Thursdays on the porch, and that grief had teeth. There were nights. I'll be honest with you, because you came to sit with me, and I won't lie to you in my own house. There were nights I almost called them, not to fight, just because they were the only parents I had, and a person can be starving for a thing even when she knows the thing is poison. The cruelest part of being thrown away by your own family isn't the cold of the first night. It's the years after, when some weak, hungry part of you keeps trying to crawl back to the very door that locked you out, because it's the only door that was ever supposed to be yours. What kept me upright in those years wasn't the deed. It was the memory of her hand on mine. But I'll tell you when the deed stopped being grief and started being something else, because there was a day. About 4 years ago, I went downtown to the county recorder's office on my lunch break in a cheap coat, half convinced I'd misremembered the whole thing, that a frightened 17-year-old had turned an old woman's wishful talk into a document that didn't exist. I gave the clerk the book number and the page my grandmother had made me memorize, and the woman behind the counter typed and went away and came back with a copy, 3 pages, with the raised seal in the corner and the recorder's stamp across the top, the date, the book, the page, my name on it, Eleanor's signature on it, witnessed and notarized, and there at the bottom where the witnesses sign, 2 names, one I didn't know, the lawyer's girl, and one I did, Walter Pence, steady as a fence post. In the careful old hand I'd watched run down a column of stolen dollars at his kitchen table when I was 17. He hadn't just shown me the theft, he'd walked over 2 doors down with the good pen in his shirt pocket and put his name to the thing that would undo it. I stood at that counter and I read my own name in the county's official record, in my grandmother's last act of love, with Walter's signature underneath it, like a man holding a door, and something in me that had been crouching for years slowly stood up. She was right. It was real. It was on file. It was not in a drawer where it could disappear. I paid the $2 for the certified copy, and I folded it into my bag, and I have carried it, one place or another, ever since. Not because I had a plan, because it was the only thing I owned that proved someone in that family had chosen me. I did not go looking for my parents. I want that understood. I built a small life, a quiet one, a job I was good at, a tiny apartment with a window that got the morning sun, a few people who'd earned the right to know me. I let the yellow house and the people in it become a closed chapter. I assumed, when I thought about it at all, that I'd simply outlive my father's claim, that one day the house would be sold or he'd die in it, and the deed would do its silent work, and I'd let the lawyers sort it without ever having to see his face. I never imagined the porch would come back to me the way it did, with the two of them on it, in person, asking. It was Walter Pence who found me first, which I have come to think is the most fitting thing in this whole story. He was past 80 by then himself, the last man left on Lattimore who remembered the street when it was young, and he tracked me down the slow, patient way old men do, through a chain of people who knew people until he had a phone number. He called me on an ordinary Tuesday, and the first thing he said, before hello almost, was, "Ruthie, it's Walter from 2 doors down, your grandmother's friend. I never stopped thinking you got a raw deal, and I never told them a word of what I knew." And then he told me everything, because he'd had a front row seat to the wreckage I'd been spared. He told me my father's health had broken. A stroke, then a second one, his right side gone weak, the strong man who'd carried the running of everything now unable to climb his own grandfather's 2 porch steps without help. He told me my mother was worn down to nothing caring for him. He told me the money had run out the way it runs out. And then, here's the part that turned the whole thing over, he told me the bank was moving on the house, the same little bank with the brass handles where he'd worked 30 years. So he knew the people, and he knew the file. There were liens. My father, it turned out, had borrowed against the yellow house over the years, again and again, the way he'd borrowed against my college account, treating it as his to spend. And now the debt had come due, and they were about to lose the roof. And it was Walter who'd set the fuse without meaning to. He told me, a little shaken, that when the title company started pulling records to sort out the mess of liens, they'd hit the transfer on death deed, the one with his own signature on it sitting in the county's books for 11 years. And the whole thing had come apart in front of my parents in some lawyer's office. They discovered, in the wreckage of their finances, that the house they'd been borrowing against and living in and counting as theirs would the day my father died, pass entirely and only to the daughter they'd thrown out on the porch. Walter said my father had gone gray as ash in that office. And then he said the thing I needed to hear from somebody, anybody, after 11 years of being the family villain. He said, "Now listen to me, because I held that pen, and I'll say it plain. Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't confused a day in her life. They're going to come to you and tell you she was. And I am telling you, as the man who watched her sign, she had a steadier hand than your father has had on his best day. You do what's right for you, but don't you let them call her a liar. I won't have it, and I won't be far." That last part mattered more than I can tell you, because it meant that when the storm came, I would not be the only living person who knew the truth. There was a witness. There was a man who would not let them rewrite it. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that, because the family did mobilize, and not all of it came at me as begging. My Aunt Carol, my father's sister, the one who'd hosted the Christmas I wasn't invited to, who'd nodded along to the story of the impossible girl for 11 years. Aunt Carol called me before my parents did, and she did not call to be kind. She called to manage me. She'd appointed herself the family's diplomat, and she came on smooth and warm. "Ruthie, sweetheart, it's been so long, we have so much to catch up on." And inside of 4 sentences, she was working me, telling me how hard this was on my mother, how my father was a changed man, how the Christian thing, the family thing, the only right thing, would be to make this whole situation go away and let your father die in his own house with his dignity. His house, his dignity, from the woman who'd helped throw the dirt over my name for a decade. I let her talk, and then I asked her one quiet question. I asked her, "Carol, did you know about the box? The one Grandma marked for me?" And there was a silence on the line, a long one. And in that silence, I understood that she had known, that they all had, and the diplomat lost her place in the script. That's the parallel thread I need you to hold, because it doesn't end there. Carol started this as their agent. By the end, she would not be. And so my parents did not write me a letter of apology. They did not call to say they were sorry for the trash bags and the changed locks and the funeral I grieved from a back pew, the box thrown in the trash, the card mailed back with their rejection written through my own hope. They got my address from Carol, and on a cold evening in November, my mother drove my failing father across town, and the two of them came up the walk of a life they'd been exiled from and waited for me on my own street to ask me for the roof. I almost didn't recognize them. That's the thing nobody warns you about. I had carried these two people in my mind for 11 years as giants. My father, a tower of a man with a voice that could flatten a room, my mother, a closed door in human form, and the people on the sidewalk were small. My father was in a wheelchair my mother had pushed from the car, a blanket over his weak legs, his face dragged down on one side, his big hands gone soft and frightened in his lap. My mother had grown old in a way that looked like it had happened all at once. They looked up at me on my own steps, and for a second nobody said anything, and the November wind moved between us, and I understood that the porch in this story was never going to be the yellow house's porch. It was going to be mine. I want you to feel this moment the way I felt it. I had imagined this scene so many times in the dark. I had 100 speeches, cold, perfect sentences filed and ready. And standing there with the actual cold air on my face and my actual mother looking up at me, every one of those speeches went somewhere I couldn't reach. My heart was going hard and slow at the same time, that strange double drum, and my hands were very calm, and there was a high, thin ringing in my ears, like the second before a glass tips off a table. I could smell the cold coming off their coats, the hospital under it, the sour sweet of long illness I'd come to know from 1,000 cafeteria nights. I noticed my father's slippers in November, on a man being driven across a city, and the sight of them did something to me I had not given permission for. Here is the dramatic irony I was standing inside of, and that you already know, and they did not. In my bag, 6 inches from my mother's pleading face, was the paper that ended this conversation before it began. They had come to negotiate for something that was already irrevocably mine. They just didn't know it. And I did. I held that knowing like a stone in my mouth, and I let them speak first. My mother spoke first. She did the thing I have come to understand is the only language people like my parents have, which is to skip the apology entirely and go straight to the need, dressed up as love. She said, "Ruthie, look at you. We've missed you so." She said it like 11 years was a misunderstanding, a long weekend. And then, before I'd said a single word back, she got to it, because the need was too big to wait behind the manners. She said, "Honey, your father's not well. You can see that, and we've had some trouble, and there's a paper about the house. Your grandmother, God rest her, she wasn't thinking clearly at the end. She signed something, and it's caused the most terrible mix-up, and we need you. We need you to sign it back to us, or to honor it the right way, so we don't lose the house. It's your father's house, Ruthie. It's your home. You wouldn't see your own parents put out on the street. You wouldn't see your own parents put out on the street." She said that to me, on my porch, with no apparent memory, none, that putting me out is exactly what they had done, that I had stood where my father's wheelchair now stood and asked her where I was supposed to go, and she had told me it wasn't her problem because I'd made my choices. I waited to feel the rage I'd rehearsed for 11 years. It didn't come. What came instead was the strangest, quietest clarity, like cold water. I looked at my father, who couldn't quite meet my eyes, whose mouth worked like he wanted to speak and the words wouldn't come, and I looked at my mother, who had already moved on from missing me to needing me in the space of one breath, and I thought, there it is. That's the whole of it. They never wanted me. They want the roof. And for one terrible second, I almost did the thing the hungry, crawling part of me had always wanted to do. I almost said yes. I almost said, of course, come in. Let me fix this, because being needed by them felt, for one disgraceful second, like being wanted by them, and I had been starving for that my whole life. She kept going, because silence frightened her. She told me she'd brought papers of her own, and she fumbled in her bag with shaking hands and pulled out a few folded sheets, something a lawyer of theirs had drawn up, a quitclaim, a thing for me to sign that would fix the mix-up, she said, make it all simple, put it back the way it should be. She held it up toward me in the porch light, her own 3 pages, and I understood that she had come not to ask but to close, that in her mind I was a formality, a signature she'd been told she needed, a loose end of her dead mother-in-law's spite that one frightened daughter could be talked into tying off. She had a pen ready. She actually had a pen ready, uncapped, in her other hand, and that pen, held out toward me in the cold, was the thing that finally burned the fog off. Because I thought of another pen, a good pen in a shirt pocket, walking over from 2 doors down, and I knew whose name was on the real paper and whose was on hers, and I knew which one the county had stamped into a book 11 years ago, and which one was worth less than the ink it took to write it. And then I thought of Eleanor. I thought of her dry hand over mine on the other porch, the real one, and her voice saying some debts are better collected late, and I understood, finally and completely, what my grandmother had given me. She hadn't given me a house. She'd given me the one thing my father had spent my whole childhood trying to take, the standing to say no and have it mean something. The deed wasn't a weapon to hurt them with. It was a wall they could no longer climb over to get at me, and I was at last on the right side of it. So I didn't argue with my mother. There was nothing to argue. I didn't take her pen and I didn't touch her papers. I set my bag on the porch rail and I unzipped it, and I took out the folded copy I'd carried for 4 years, soft now at its creases, and I unfolded all 3 pages slowly in the cold porch light, and I held them so my mother could see the seal and the stamp, and I said very quietly, I know about the paper. I've known for 11 years. Grandma read it to me on the Lattimore porch the year you put me out. This is a transfer on death deed. It's recorded with the county. You can see the stamp, the book, and page. It means the house was always Grandma's while she lived, and the day Dad dies, it doesn't go to the bank, and it doesn't go into any will. It comes to me. Only to me. She did that on purpose. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she was thinking more clearly than anyone in that family ever gave her credit for. I watched my mother's face do the thing I'd waited 11 years to see, and I'll tell you, it gave me no joy. The need drained out of it, and something uglier came up underneath. The old contempt, the same look she'd worn in the lit doorway. She said the paper wasn't valid, that Grandma was confused, that I'd manipulated a dying old woman, and I let her say it, all of it, the way you let a wave finish breaking. Then I said, the county didn't think she was confused, the notary didn't, the witnesses didn't. It's been sitting in the official record for 11 years with all of their signatures on it, and it never disappeared because Grandma made sure it couldn't. You can have it looked at by every lawyer in this state. It will say the same thing every time. The house is mine the day he passes. That part is already done. It was done while you were still telling people I ran away. She opened her mouth to call my grandmother a liar one more time, and I stopped her with one sentence, the only hard thing I let myself say. I said, before you finish that, One of the names witnessing that signature is Walter Pence. He's still alive, Mother. He's 2 doors down where he's always been. You're welcome to walk over and tell him to his face that the woman he watched sign with a steady hand didn't know what she was doing. He's been waiting 11 years for one of you to try. And I watched that land because she knew Walter, knew he was honest to the bone, knew the whole street trusted his word over my father's, and she shut her mouth. The story they'd built needed my grandmother to be a confused old woman and me to be a manipulator, and it could not survive a living, lucid, respected witness standing 2 doors down. The wall my grandmother built had a man standing on top of it. My father made a sound then, the first sound he'd made. He got out one word, dragged and broken from the weak side of his mouth, and the word was my name, Ruth. Just that. And his good hand came up off the blanket toward me, shaking. And I will not lie to you and tell you that didn't reach in and grab something in my chest, because it did. He was my father. He was ruined and frightened and old, and he was my father, and some animal part of a child never stops wanting that hand to reach for her. But I had learned, finally, the difference between a hand reaching to hold you and a hand reaching to hold on. I didn't take it. I made it undeniable instead. Now, I have to be careful with you here, because this is the place where a story like mine usually turns into a fairy tale, and I promised you the truth on this porch. I did not stand over my broken father in his wheelchair and throw them off into the November night to freeze. That's the revenge fantasy, and I understand why some of you wanted it, and I'm telling you I didn't do it, because what I did instead was harder, and I think it was better. What the deed gave me was not a way to hurt them. It was a way to be the one who decided. For 11 years, they had held every decision about my life, where I slept, whether I ate, whether I existed in the family story at all. The paper my grandmother recorded simply moved that power across the porch, into my hands, and the first thing I did with it was something they had never once done for me. I made a choice that was actually about caring for a person, instead of dressed up to look like it. Here is what I did, and here is the boundary, because I know that's what you're waiting for. I told my parents the house was not going back into my father's name, not ever. That ship had sailed 11 years ago into the county recorder's office, and it was not coming back. But I told them that I was not going to put a sick old man out on the street, because I am not them, and I was not going to let what they did to me decide what kind of person I'd be. I called the lawyer whose firm had drawn up my grandmother's deed the next morning, and I did it properly. Because the deed meant the house would be mine, I had standing the bank had to listen to, standing my parents never had. I worked out an arrangement. The liens dealt with, the house pulled back from the edge it was on terms that were mine to set, not my father's to spend against, and I let my parents go on living in the yellow house, not as its owners, as people I was allowing to stay in the home that would be mine, for as long as my father needed it. The locks on that house I had changed, and then I had a key cut and I gave it to my mother, and I said, "You're not put out. I'm not you. But understand what this is. You live here because I say so now. The roof is mine. I'm letting you keep it. That's not the same as it being yours." My mother didn't thank me. I didn't expect her to. Thanking me would have meant admitting there was something to thank me for, and that would have meant admitting all the rest of it. She took the key with a stiff hand and a stiffer face, and I think a part of her hated me more in that moment than she ever had, because the worst thing you can do to a person who threw you away is be the bigger one in the end. That's all right. I didn't do it for her thanks. I did it because somewhere a woman named Eleanor had decided, with her last strength, that the people who took my childhood would not also get to keep the porch, and I had finally grown into the size of that gift. There was one more turn I didn't see coming, and it came from the one direction I'd written off. 2 weeks after that porch, my Aunt Carol called again, and this time she wasn't the diplomat. Something in her had broken loose. She told me she'd gone home from all of this and couldn't sleep, that my one question about the box had gotten its hooks in her and wouldn't let go, that she'd finally made my mother admit out loud what had happened to my grandmother's things and to the card I'd mailed and to the rest of it. And Carol, who had nodded along for 11 years, who had hosted the Christmas, who had started this whole episode as their agent sent to manage me, Carol said the words none of the rest of them ever would. She said, "I believed them, Ruthie. It was easier to believe them than to look at what that would mean about your father and about me for going along. I'm ashamed. I should have come for you years ago." It wasn't a clean ending. An apology 11 years late doesn't give a person back her childhood, but she'd been the family's turncoat against me once, swallowing their story whole, and now she'd turned again, this time toward the truth. And she did one concrete thing with it. She tracked down where my grandmother's box had gone, found that the Gold Star spelling test had survived in an old neighbor's keepsake drawer, and put it back in my hands. The treaty between nations returned. A person like Carol can come back to the truth, but it costs them the comfortable story first. Hers cost her, and she paid it, and that's the difference between her and my mother. My father died 11 months later, in the yellow house in the front room that looks out on the porch my grandfather built. The deed did its quiet work the way she'd designed it to, 11 years in advance. No will to fight over, no court, no fight at all. The house passed to me in an afternoon with a stamp, the way she'd planned it on a Thursday when I was 17 and frightened and didn't understand what she was giving me. My mother still lives there. I let her stay. We are not close. I don't think we ever will be, and I've stopped grieving that mostly. Walter Pence lived to see it. He came to the door the day the house became mine in name, as well as in fact, the good pen still in his shirt pocket, and he said, "Your grandmother would call that a job finished." He passed himself the following winter, the last of that old street, and I was at his funeral in the front pew, because some debts of kindness you pay in person and on time. But once in a while, on a Thursday, I drive over to the yellow house that's mine now, and I sit on my grandfather's porch, where my grandmother shelled peas and taught me to read, and where a man once told me family doesn't owe family a roof. And I think about how wrong he was. Family doesn't owe family a roof, but love does. My grandmother loved me, and she made sure of mine 11 years before I needed it, with a seal and a stamp and a county clerk who'll never know the weight of what he filed, and a man with a good pen who walked over from 2 doors down to swear it was true. If you've ever been the one a family decided to throw away, the one they rewrote into the villain of a story you weren't even allowed to defend, and you felt that hungry, hateful, hopeful pull to crawl back to the very door that locked you out, I want you to hear me, because I sat where you're sitting. And you are not crazy, and you are not the villain they made you, and the steadiness you can't feel yet is in you, waiting, the way the deed sat waiting in the county's books. Someone, somewhere, a grandmother, a neighbor with a good pen, even if it's only you yourself from here on out, can choose you on purpose. Tell me in the comments if you want, not for the drama of it, for the company of it. Because the loneliest part of being thrown away is believing nobody ever chose you, right up until the day you find the paper with the seal on it that says somebody did. There's another story I'll tell you sometime, on another quiet night, about a different house and a different woman, a sister who handed me a folder at our mother's grave, an itemized bill for the years she spent taking care of everything, never once imagining I'd kept a record of my own. That one's for another night. For now, it's enough that you came up the steps and sat with me. Doors, not walls. I'll say it the way my grandmother taught me to live it. The people who put you out in the cold don't get to keep the porch, but you don't have to become them to take it back. You can hold the deed and still cut the key. You can be the wall that keeps you safe and the door that lets you stay the kind of person they never were. For the nights the house is too quiet, remember that the quietest paper in the county can outlast the loudest man at the table. Mine waited 11 years for me. I'm glad it waited, and I'm glad I was finally big enough to lift it. Pour out what's gone cold in your cup. Leave the porch light on for somebody who got put out tonight, and come back and sit with me again soon.